History often turns not on grand declarations of war, but on moments when restraint barely holds. There are crises that flicker and fade, forgotten footnotes in diplomatic archives, and then there are those that come terrifyingly close to igniting something far larger. In the early years of the 20th century, one such moment unfolded on the northern coast of South America, where debt, empire, and ambition collided. For a brief and largely forgotten instant, Venezuela stood at the center of a global confrontation, one that nearly pulled three European empires and the rising power of the United States into open war. What followed reshaped American foreign policy, fractured European alliances, and hinted at a world already sliding toward far greater conflict. But history chose restraint, or did it? In 1902, Venezuela found itself on the brink of invasion by three European empires. General Cipriano Castro had seized power just 3 years earlier, inheriting a nation financially broken after decades of misrule by the so-called yellow governments that followed Venezuela's devastating Fifth Civil War, the Federal War. Public finances were in chaos, state authority was fragile, and the country was already slipping into yet another internal conflict. That conflict, the Sixth Venezuelan Civil War, known as the Revolución Libertadora, was no minor uprising. It was a massive rebellion led by banker General Manuel Antonio Matos, whose forces were quietly funded by backers in New York and British Trinidad. While fighting for survival against Matos, Castro simultaneously attempted something far more dangerous: repairing Venezuela's shattered finances. His solution was blunt. Castro refused to recognize Venezuela's foreign debts, roughly 190 million bolívares, or about $38 million, a large portion of which was owed to European creditors. That decision reverberated across the Atlantic. Britain, Germany, and later Italy responded by forming a united front, formalized in the tripartite protocol, often called the Ironclad Agreement, which declared that none of the powers would withdraw until all three had been fully compensated. Britain's motivations went beyond debt. London was increasingly uneasy about growing American influence in the Caribbean and the looming construction of the Panama Canal. In December 1902, Britain, Germany, and Italy delivered ultimatums to Caracas. When Castro rejected them outright, the response was swift: a naval blockade of Venezuela. European warships seized Venezuelan vessels, sank outdated gunboats, and bombarded Puerto Cabello, the country's most vital port. What began as a financial enforcement action soon escalated into a belligerent blockade, one that included direct attacks on coastal forts. The British could sustain these operations with ease, but Germany faced a logistical nightmare. Lacking Caribbean ports of its own, Berlin relied on precarious access to Dutch harbors in Curaçao, despite Dutch neutrality, and even British facilities in Trinidad and Jamaica, along with St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies. At first, President Theodore Roosevelt appeared willing to let the Europeans discipline what he called a misbehaving Venezuela, so long as no territory changed hands. But as shells fell and forts burned, Roosevelt grew uneasy. He later claimed to have issued a private warning to the German ambassador: accept diplomacy, or the U.S. Navy would sail south. Whether that ultimatum truly occurred remains disputed, but American pressure soon became unmistakable. Ultimately, Castro authorized the U.S. minister in Caracas, Herbert W. Bowen, to negotiate on Venezuela's behalf. In February 1903, the European powers convened in Washington, D.C., and agreed to the Washington Protocols. Venezuela would dedicate 30% of customs revenues from its major ports to debt repayment. Britain, Germany, and Italy would be paid first, an outcome Roosevelt found deeply troubling as it appeared to reward imperial coercion. Later that year, Roosevelt responded by reshaping American doctrine. His Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine asserted the United States' right to intervene in Latin America to maintain stability, ensure debt repayment, and prevent European interference, casting America as the hemisphere's self-appointed enforcer. The Venezuelan crisis also marked a turning point in European relations. Britain, angered by American disapproval and increasingly wary of German ambitions, resolved never again to cooperate with Germany in the Western Hemisphere. Economic rivalry, naval expansion, and disputes over Morocco and China deepened the divide, until war finally erupted in Europe a decade later. But history might have turned another way. At the time of the crisis, both the United States and Germany were emerging naval powers. Britain still ruled the seas, but felt increasingly threatened. American strategists viewed Germany, not Britain, as the most likely future rival in the Caribbean. Naval intelligence reports warned that Berlin was exploring options to establish bases on Margarita Island or St. Thomas, potentially controlling approaches to the future Panama Canal. By December 1902, Roosevelt had concentrated a massive American fleet, 53 warships, nearly every U.S. battleship, off Puerto Rico. German shelling of Puerto Cabello and later Fort San Carlos alarmed Washington. Had an American vessel, such as the observing gunboat Marietta, been struck accidentally, war might have been unavoidable. Yet the greatest danger lay elsewhere. A German attempt to turn the blockade into a permanent territorial foothold, establishing a naval base during Venezuela's civil war, would have crossed a red line. Roosevelt made that clear. Imagine then an alternate path. A German landing force establishing a temporary administration in a Venezuelan port, mirroring Britain's occupation of Egypt. This would have represented the culmination of Kaiser Wilhelm II's Weltpolitik, a break from Bismarck's continental focus toward global naval power and colonial expansion. It would have been Germany's long-sought place in the sun, championed by figures like von Bülow and Admiral von Tirpitz. The precedent already existed. Germany's seizure of Jiaozhou Bay in China in 1897 began as a temporary occupation and became a 99-year lease. Venezuela could have followed the same path, fulfilling America's worst fears. In such a scenario, the United States would almost certainly have declared war. Britain, however, would not have followed Germany into that conflict. A territorial seizure would violate the spirit of the Ironclad Agreement and give London a legal escape, one it would gladly take. The protocol was already unpopular in Britain, and maintaining good relations with Washington remained a cornerstone of British policy. Italy, whose participation was largely symbolic and whose navy lacked real strength, would likely have followed Britain into neutrality. Germany would have stood alone. Its navy would not reach full strength until 1920. Though Berlin possessed a theoretical invasion plan, Operations Plan 30, Germany had no Caribbean bases, no reliable supply lines, and no friendly ports. Britain and the Netherlands would deny access. Fuel and ammunition would vanish before operations even began. Any conflict would collapse Germany's global position. France would consolidate Morocco. Russia would maneuver in the Balkans. Italy might abandon Germany altogether. Humiliated, overstretched, and isolated, Germany would be forced inward, rebuilding its doctrine as Europe drifted ever closer to catastrophe. But that ending is too neat. So before we conclude, let's consider something stranger, an outcome that defies strategy, twists alliances, and opens the door to a far more unsettling possibility. Let us imagine, then, a far stranger path. One where Britain, instead of stepping away, chooses the opposite course. In this version of events, London, and by extension Italy, fully commit to Germany's attempt to carve out a permanent territorial foothold in Venezuela. With that decision, the crisis ceases to be a diplomatic standoff and becomes something far more dangerous. Germany could then invoke the Triple Alliance, drawing Austria-Hungary into the conflict as a supportive power. While the alliance was formally defensive, German naval planners believed that a war against the United States would only be survivable if Germany's European flank was shielded from French or Russian opportunism. Austria-Hungary's role, therefore, would not be naval or colonial, but strategic, anchoring Central Europe while Germany gambled across the Atlantic. Britain, for its part, might even consider expanding the conflict further by calling upon Japan through the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance. Yet the treaty's language was narrow and cautious. Its provisions focused almost entirely on East Asia, China, and Korea. And Article 2 explicitly stated that if one signatory went to war with a single power, the other would remain neutral. Japan would only be obligated to intervene if Britain faced a coalition. That definition alone would invite debate. Was the United States acting alone, or as the de facto protector of Venezuela? And what if other American republics entered the conflict? Argentina had already condemned European actions in Venezuela as unjust. Brazil, despite its large German immigrant population, was steadily aligning its foreign policy toward Washington. Cuba, meanwhile, functioned as little more than an American dependency. Any of these states could support the United States diplomatically or militarily, creating precisely the kind of coalition that might allow Britain to call upon Japan. Even then, Japanese intervention would remain unlikely. Tokyo rarely acted without clear national advantage. Joining a transatlantic war held little appeal, even if it presented tempting opportunities, such as striking at the American Philippines. More plausibly, Japan might exploit the chaos by seizing German holdings in China, directly undermining this supposed ironclad alliance rather than reinforcing it. Logistics alone would doom the European effort. As in the earlier scenario, France would likely consolidate its grip over Morocco while attention drifted elsewhere. If the Netherlands maintained neutrality in Curaçao, German and British warships would lose a vital Caribbean staging point. Dutch cooperation would be equally improbable, since the United States would almost certainly target Curaçao immediately rather than tolerate its use by hostile fleets. Without Dutch ports, Germany would become entirely dependent on British colonial facilities in Trinidad, British Guiana, and Jamaica, an arrangement that placed Anglo-German forces at a severe disadvantage. The United States, by contrast, operated from Puerto Rico, the mainland, and newly secured rights in Cuba and Panama. Geography alone tilted the balance decisively. Strategically, the Europeans would default to German planning, since Britain had never seriously prepared for a full-scale war in the Caribbean. German doctrine envisioned drawing the American fleet south from Puerto Rico into a decisive engagement near Venezuela, hoping to secure temporary command of the sea. With troops ashore, Britain and Germany would likely escalate to occupying ports such as La Guaira and Puerto Cabello. Yet even German planners recognized the scale of the problem. General Alfred von Schlieffen estimated that pacifying Venezuela's coastal regions would require at least 50,000 troops, an impossible number to deploy quickly across the Atlantic. Worse still, a foreign occupation would likely unify Venezuela's fractured civil war factions against a common enemy. Resistance would be relentless. Venezuela's terrain favored guerrilla warfare, hills overlooking ports, dense vegetation, and a climate hostile to European armies. Malaria and yellow fever already stalked the coast. Defenders would fight from every hillside and jungle path, inflicting casualties far beyond what the occupying forces could absorb. Even with limited British land support from Guyana, the occupation would unravel rapidly. Castro himself had already demonstrated how porous the blockade truly was, reopening trade routes through Colombia and diverting commerce to inland ports like Tucacas and Cristobal Colón. European fleets might linger offshore and even destroy what remained of Venezuela's small navy, but sustaining dominance would be impossible once American intervention began. Naval war would soon erupt across the Caribbean. German tactical studies suggested that a brutal opening blow against the U.S. fleet might succeed if America were unprepared. But Roosevelt had ensured the opposite. The fleet was concentrated, fueled, and ready. German and British squadrons would face a modern force fighting near its own bases, while they operated nearly 5,000 miles from home. Defeat would be inevitable. Admiral Tirpitz had built Germany's battleships for the North Sea, not tropical warfare or prolonged overseas conflict. Even Britain's formidable Caribbean presence would pale beside the full strength of the U.S. Navy. American forces might go further still, striking British resupply hubs in Trinidad and Jamaica, and even occupying Bermuda and the Bahamas to neutralize any threat to the American mainland. At a moment when Britain was already withdrawing forces from the Western Hemisphere to face Germany in the North Sea, such a war would catch London mid-transition, strategically exposed and overstretched. To enforce the Monroe Doctrine fully, Washington might even strike at British Guiana or Belize, reshaping hemispheric borders under American terms. Once the first major engagement ended, as it surely would in American victory, Roosevelt could pursue harsh terms. Annexation of remaining European colonies in the Americas would no longer be unthinkable. If accepted, Europe would suffer total humiliation. If rejected, the war would spill into the Pacific, where American forces could seize German Samoa and secure strategic positions around the Philippines. American industry would awaken early, years before World War I, building a two-ocean navy unmatched by any rival. But regardless of duration, the outcome would be the same: European withdrawal. No empire could defeat the United States on its own doorstep, against its navy and its immense industrial potential. The consequences would echo for decades. The Anglo-American special relationship might never form. The Caribbean would become an American lake. Britain and Germany would emerge humiliated. Italy would drift toward France. Austria-Hungary might lose faith in Berlin, and Berlin in its Kaiser. Britain would seek continental alliances earlier than in our timeline. Germany, weakened and isolated, would look east, perhaps toward the Ottomans, for protection. And though the path to the First World War would remain familiar, when an Austrian archduke fell in Sarajevo, the world might burn without an American return. History, in this version, would still collapse into war, just with a very different balance of power watching from across the Atlantic.